Hi and welcome to this talk on artificially intelligent audio visualizations by myself, Mick Grierson, Nick Collins, Thor Magnuson and Chris Kiefer. We're from Creative Computing Institute at the University of the Arts, the Music Department at the University of Durham and also University of Sussex. And we're also part of a team called Mimic, which is an AHRC funded team that's working on machine learning and music. And recently we've been branching out, thinking more in a more considered way about audiovisual systems, and that's what we want to talk about. So a little bit about AI to begin with. This is where I have to explain AI and machine learning in about 30 seconds, so I'm not going to do that. I mean, I suppose it's a feature of the last 5 years that lots of talks have started out by saying, hey, AI is now amazing, and I'm not going to say that either. As true as it's been in some ways, it's not necessarily very meaningful just to say it's incredible. It doesn't advance any specific argument. But new forms of biologically inspired and layered neural networks can represent images and sounds in ways that capture aspects of our sonic and visual experience that we can't all necessarily describe, right? But we'd certainly notice them if they were missing, such as the quality of the edges, the way things blend. And this is because the representation of information about images and also sounds, which are important for perception, such as interdependent high frequency and low frequency distributions, for example, can be very easily separated and recombined really effectively. They can be represented and separated and combined. And as most of us have seen, these systems are quite robust to creative manipulation. And this has led to this creative AI approach, which lots of artists are now engaging with. And people are using these systems for still image and moving image generation and for some sound work, which is also great. And the vast majority of it's still in this image generation, individual still image generation, for a number of reasons, not least of which is simplicity. It's really easy to go on Google Colab, create a style transfer image and submit it for a year 2 computer science project, which is, simultaneously depressing and also sort of amusing. Audio generation has increased in its efficiency, beginning with low-resolution models such as WaveNet, and now we have more complex models, including OpenAI's Jukebox, which, although it's not democratized and available, it's still an interesting system. It uses a number of different interacting techniques to generate music that kind of is statistically similar to the things that we would normally create. So it sounds like music, although it's, again, low quality. But what's interesting is, notwithstanding the large amounts of debate around notions of creativity and consciousness that all that work has sparked, very little has been said about the way these systems might interact. And this is important because, as we all know, human perception and cognition is not about how we perceive individual channels of experience and information discretely. It's also, and sometimes more importantly, about the way multimodal sensory information is connected, processed, integrated and combined in order to become human experience. Therefore, it seems obvious that in order to create better AI and machine learning systems, we need to explore both practically and theoretically how such systems can be integrated, how they might impact on one another, and more precisely, what kinds of representations might be produced when we do this. So this inevitably leads us to the notion of an audiovisual synthesis. Audio and visual information are synthesized into a single aesthetic, philosophical and experiential entity, and how this can be applied to the development and manipulation of contemporary machine learning systems. Over the last few years, the Mimic team have been exploring these ideas on our days off to try and understand what technical approaches might work in the future, what aesthetic outcomes they might lead to, and what affordances they might offer creatives in the future. So first I want to talk about this piece by Memo Acton and Jennifer Walsh that was produced in 2018 called Ultra Chunk. And this work arose partly out of the work that Memo has been doing as part of his PhD at Goldsmiths with myself and also Rebecca Feebrink. There are a number of innovations in the work that are worth pointing out, the first one being its real-time audio and video generation using deep learning. And real-time audio and video generation is the subject of Memo's PhD, and it's some of the first work in that field. The system's trained on audio and visual elements by collaborator Jennifer Walsh, and the model is similar to the one that we detail in the paper Learning to See You Are What You See, which we presented at SIGGRAPH in 2019. The audio model is a variation on the one used as part of our Massive Attack installation, a mezzanine versus magnet, which produces real-time generative audio from deep learning models, Currently, that's on tour for 5 years as part of the Barbican's exhibition AI More Than Human. And so we combine these two systems, Learning to See and the kind of grandma engine in Mezzanine versus Magnet. Memo takes these two and fuses them to build this audiovisual model. So they're trained on the audio and video files simultaneously, which are performances of Jennifer Walsh, and the output is in reference to both those things together. The audio and visual model take these images as the live input and produce an audio-visual output, which is then used as a second performer in a live duet. There are lots of debates you could have about this, and I'd encourage you to go right ahead, but of interest and note in this presentation is that multimodal input is being used both for training and also for inference in real time to produce a live, real-time and responsive outcome. So that's the first piece I wanted to reference. The second piece is by another of our PhD students, Brian Dunphy. And this piece I am going to mispronounce. I believe it is pronounced Agfasa Ais Aris 2019. I apologise for those people who know how it's supposed to be pronounced. But this work's very different from the prior piece, and it's not an attempt to render audio and visual information from generative models, although it does do that, but those models aren't AI models. Instead, it focuses on using the AI interactively as part of the composition process to allow the composer to create audio-visual mappings between fractal generation image and sound processes in VR. So as users, as the people experiencing the work move through VR space, they interactively sculpt audio-visual installations using the fractal generation process, and machine learning maps their bodily interactions to the generators, the Mandelbrot generators and the sound generators, like a Mandelbrot sound generator, which comes out of this. So the connections between sounds and image generation systems are being connected, are being maintained and mapped by machine learning systems, and the composer has done this interactively. So the image engine is built using ray marching, which is a bespoke ray marching system, so that you can do real-time multidimensional fractal synthesis. And the user interaction is all managed in C++ with machine learning models that are parameterizing both the sound output and the video output based on mappings that have been generated by the composer using machine learning. So audience members can use pre-trained models, but also you could, as a composer, just create with it if you wished. So that's that. These works are simply a couple of examples, creative examples, to demonstrate how our students in our lab have been exploring notions of audiovisual interaction using AI over the last few years. However, we've also been working hard to create and explore new techniques so that we can work towards understanding what kinds of approaches we might be able to use in the future to create similar works. And I'm going to hand over to my colleagues to explain some of those now.
In the next part of this presentation, we look at some techniques and technologies for using artificial intelligence with audio visualizations. A common technique is to use an autoencoder. An autoencoder, its purpose is to create a latent space which is a compressed representation of its input. We can then use this latent space for cross-modal mappings. To learn this space, we create a network which is taught to recreate its inputs at its outputs. However, we use a central layer which is smaller than the input and output layers. Therefore, when we train the network, it is forced to create a compressed representation in this central layer. The left half of the autoencoder is called the encoder. This creates a mapping from the input to the compressed feature space, and then the right-hand half of the autoencoder is called the decoder. To use autoencoders in audiovisual work, we can train two different models, one in the audio domain, one in the visual domain. In this example, we take spectral data from audio and learn a compressed feature space from this audio. We then do the same for video data. Once these networks are trained, we can combine the models together. In this example, we encode spectral data from sound and then If these two latent spaces are of the same size, we can then use the audio latent space, the feature space, to map into video. So we encode audio, but then decode that feature into video. We'll now see an example of audio to visual mapping. In this example, a variational autoencoder learns a feature space based on a dataset of music. The feature representation in the autoencoder is then mapped into a generative adversarial network which produces video. We'll now see a further example of using autoencoders for audiovisual mappings. In this example, the audio data and video data is separately extracted from a video segment. This data is then used to train both audio and video autoencoders. We then take these trained networks and swap the decoders so that we're mapping from video to audio in one case and audio to video in another case. The original video is fed into these encoders, and then the decoded output is combined into a new film. An alternative approach to audio visualization from deep architectures is to use conceptor-controlled recurrent neural networks, or CCRNNs. CCRNNs are a form of neural network that can be taught to regenerate patterns. They can be used for sound resynthesis and video resynthesis. For video resynthesis, we can take an alternative approach to the deep architectures we've looked at earlier. Instead of looking at a video as a series of frames, we can look at a video through its pixels and look how each pixel's brightness or colour varies over time. You can then train a very small micro neural network to learn how to control the brightness of each pixel in the video, and then combine these neural networks together to play a whole video. Once you've trained, you can interact with them in real time, you can modulate them using music, or you can look at their properties to generate music, and you can also create different effects by getting this hive of little neural networks to interact with each other. The networks that we've seen presented fall under an emerging approach in machine learning which we might call hybridity or network bending. Under this approach, we look at AI and machine learning as a creative material, and we look for points where we can manipulate the processes in machine learning for different artistic outcomes. Machine learning models often have thousands or millions of parameters, so there are plenty of points which we can try and manipulate either when we're running them or when we're training them. For example, we could remove a layer of one network and plug in a layer of another network and see how two networks interact together. Or we could find some specific points within the neural network that seem sensitive to modulation and then modulate them using audio or video features. The networks that we've seen so far in this presentation all learn from a single mode, either audio or visual. And then these networks are combined in different creative ways to create audio visualizations. But how about learning from audio-visual information? There's some really interesting research pointing in this direction at the moment. For example, this study by Adil looks at the way in which the human brain integrates multisensory information and proposes a new type of neural network, the contextually adaptive neural network, which can learn from multimodal information. And they show in their study that this network can successfully learn from audiovisual material. So perhaps one of the next stages in using AI in audio visualization is to train these types of networks to resynthesize audiovisual material and then look at ways using network bending techniques in which they can be creatively manipulated. Another future challenge is a familiar one, that of real-time performance. Neural networks can be extremely resource hungry. Fortunately, new research is showing some interesting ways of optimizing neural networks for real-time performance. For example, binarized neural networks, where we take trained models and simplify them, and also field programmable gate arrays to run neural networks which are effective at running models extremely quickly but are limited to small models at the moment. In summary, this presentation has been about the use of artificial intelligence techniques in audiovisual practice. We've seen some examples from artists who use AI techniques in their work and looked at how AI can be seen as a creative material. We've looked at some different techniques for mapping between different domains using machine learning models, and looked at some broader techniques which focus on how to hack and manipulate models for different creative effects. We've also seen where the next generation of these models could go, looking at how models can support multisensory integration instead of focusing on the audiovisual domain separately. Thank you for listening.
I am Eleni Ira-Panouria, an artist and researcher, currently based in Paris, France. I work as a teaching and research fellow at Gustave Eiffel University, where I teach sound design and sound art in undergraduate and master programs. I have a background in visual and sound arts, and my research focuses on the intersections of sound, visual, and spatial dimensions. I am exploring the development of such complex morphologies, and I'm interested in their potential within artistic, design, and social processes. This presentation focuses on the interactive process between sounds and images used in my internet piece Web Canvas. Web Canvas centers on the simultaneous transformation of image and sound through online participation. This work integrates electroacoustic sound material and a digitized monoprint of an abstract landscape in a custom web application developed in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in collaboration with software engineer Kosmas Tsakmakidis. First, I would like to share some information about the background of Web Canvas. The idea of the work occurred to me between 2014 and 2016 when I was working on a series of abstract landscape monoprints titled Topos. I became concerned with the way I could use sound to further develop time and material representations in the depicted landscapes. The printmaking technique of monoprints influenced the way I thought about image and sound. Monoprints are single impressions of images made on block of material. In my case, I used ink on a metal plate. In printing the image on paper, one also captures the gestures of this drawing and that moment in time. I was interested in the way these shapes, drawing gestures, colors, and textures could sound like, and how sound could expand their temporal dimension in an interactive and participatory manner. I wanted to move beyond the notational approach and create an audiovisual space directly related to the visual language of my monoprints. My aim was to share this audiovisual space with a global audience and allow participants to make sense of their own actions on the work through visual and auditory feedback. This is when our collaboration with software engineer Kosmas Tsakmakidis began. Online space provides with expanded temporality and flexibility when it comes to sharing and interacting with an artwork. As Moss mentioned, online artworks can be viewed anywhere, at any time, and I would like to add here, for any duration. These virtual spaces can generate alternative modes of interaction with an audiovisual piece, for the artist to further connect with an audience, and the audience to actually manipulate and transform the creative work, personalize it, and become in this way part of the creative process. Peter Weibel and Timothy Drakri discussed that an internet artwork operates between virtual online space and real space through audience interaction. Web Canvas exists in an expanding digital environment, a creative encounter widely accessible and participatory, turned into a shared creative tool between artist and audience. Now back to the development of Web Canvas. I started by digitizing and cutting a monoprint into individual forms and shapes, moving and repositioning them to enable variations and manipulate the image over time. I then composed sounds based on these fragments of the original images. Moving from image to sound, my intention was to incorporate visual dimensions into sound qualities. My image to sound approach involved three main visual characteristics: color, shape, and texture. Color and tones from black to gray and red corresponded to frequency. Red color and gray corresponded to medium-high frequency, and darker tones of gray until black to low-frequency sounds. Shape, such as length, width, roundness, or the way a form unfolds in space, was considered in terms of duration and movement in the sound domain. Visual textures concern density, sound source, and rhythmic variation. The ensemble of these audiovisual relationships was involved in each piece of the canvas. The corresponding qualities from visual to sonic were thought of in a flexible manner, and these three main categories were guiding rather than precisely defining the outcome of the piece. I used electronic sounds, field recordings, and cello recordings that I performed. These were further processed according to the audiovisual relationships defined. The mode of interaction of this work allows to compose the canvas visually or sonically by clicking and dragging its pieces and repositioning them on the canvas, which in turn triggers changes in the sound of the work. Users can hover their mouse over each piece to listen to its individual sound. The sonic and visual landscape can be played back, reset, erased, and recreated according to the user's own aesthetic decisions. Web Canvas shifts the aesthetic power over the outcome between artist and audience. The multidimensional mode of this practice supports the idea of how changing one element will affect the whole. How we are bonded with everything around us is symbolized by the way each piece of the canvas constantly depends on the state of a larger entity. Audience participants are invited to make sense of their actions based on the simultaneous change of sound to visual. The audiovisual composition is related to the mode of interaction as the positioning of each image on the canvas and the playback function determines how the piece sounds. Web canvas can be composed based on vision or based on listening. Sometimes the visual guides the positioning, and other times listening to individual pieces affects where each piece is placed on the canvas. I will now play an example. The manipulation of the canvas shown in the first part of the video is visually oriented, whereas the second part is mostly sound oriented. Web Canvas was created between 2016 and 2017, and it was released online in 2017. It is made of 60 draggable images cut from the initial monoprint and 60 sound samples individually created in response to the visual characteristics of each piece and the whole monoprint. These transparent PNG image files are turned into HTML image elements in order to be loaded on the canvas. HTML is then connected to CSS for precisely mapping images to their position on the canvas. Using JavaScript, images are made draggable and are linked with a sound file. JavaScript allows us to use hover to trigger sound and create a forward loop from left to right to play the composition of web canvas. The overall duration of the initial composition of the canvas is 16 seconds, but this can be further modified and expanded according to interaction. To delve into more detail about the development of web canvas, each piece was assigned a position via X and Y parameters indicated as top and left values in the code, as shown by the black arrow on the bottom right of this slide. The 60 different pieces were mapped to a position in order to form the initial image of the monoprint in a puzzle-like manner. The three main functions of web canvas are reset, play, and clear. This slide shows some parts of the JavaScript code that structure these functions. Starting from the reset function on the top of this page, it makes web canvas clear the current position of the pieces, then load the 60 images to their assigned positions, and then assigns them the 60 sound samples. Images become draggable, and sound is played on hover. To play the sounds of web canvas, the application starts scanning the pieces from left to right, reads the position, and triggers the sounds accordingly. The clear function removes the pieces from the canvas, including images and sounds. Web canvas could offer new directions in technical expansion for structured files such as XML. Such files could contain, for example, an image URL, positioning information about X, Y, and Z parameters, and a sound URL. This could enable loading audiovisual artworks to a file. Web canvas could be further enhanced with video files and an immersive experience such as 3D sound. An additional function could be created to allow adding or removing individual images and sounds. Also, creating different play modes, for example, reading the canvas in multiple directions, not only horizontally, but also perhaps vertically, diagonally, and in terms of the depth parameter, could provide with more complex audiovisual navigation. Another interesting area would be to enable multiple user image-sound interactions. These features could open up new ways of presenting and creating audiovisual pieces in the online environment, and especially now that our usual performance and exhibition spaces are not available. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, this is Barry Moon, and Doug Nottingham and I had this duo called Pincushioned. We've been around for a bunch of years. We have a new album out, which is part of the inspiration for coming to you. Most of the work we've done in the past has all been live performance, and in the age of COVID, that's what we ended up with. So now I've started looking at how to produce the video for our performance. This particular track is one by Ted Moore, worked on this with us, a friend of ours, and I should quickly show you the max patch. You can see that at the top we have an asset play, which is what makes this definitely not a performance interface. But you got it coming into a bonk object, which if you've played around with Max, you'll know that it puts out a list of peaks for every transient that it hits. Those transients are then checked for a threshold level and then multiplied out and added together to access images from in a file. This sort of work is reminiscent for me of the mid to late 90s visuals that were usually live performed in, some of you might remember, Soft VNS, which was the video program that I was fond of, or the one that became Jitter, sort of, which was NATO. NATO didn't really become Jitter, but most of the historians out there will tell you a long story. But anyway, that's kind of irrelevant, showing you this because it's got nothing to do with a live performance. It's just shameless promotion for our album. This is a piece from some time ago, some number of years ago, using the Wii remote to perform. It's kind of typical of a lot of the earlier visual stuff we did, kind of simplistic. The visual itself was one of my first forays into programming in Unity, and this would take the Wii remote in through OSC, and as with a lot of this software, sending OSC from one application to another, which is a little bit of a pain. Let's skip ahead in this just to see what happens in it. So the reason for showing you some of this stuff is to show you where we've been in terms of our visual work and where we might end up going in the future, which we really don't know, but it has to do with the eye tracking thing, has to do with the fact that I can't play guitar and control all this stuff at the same time. So we're looking really at just eye tracking as a way to control the live video. Maybe we'll look at one more example of an older tune just to see what kinds of controls we might be needing. This is a piece called Into, which is the word in with the number 2 without a break. And it's again one of our earlier works. And in this piece you can see there's some movement. That's all being handled by some noise or just some random generation. And then it also, on the MIDI controller that I'm using to produce the that drone, for example, you know, like hitting an F sharp, because that's how good a keyboard player I am. It's a nice easy one to find. And that same controller, I'm using some knobs on there to change parameters, such as I can change larger movements and I can change that kind of distortion. You see there's a kind of three-dimensional noise that's applied. This is done in Touch Designer, by the way. So I can also control, any moment now we might see some little colorful bubbles, but we might jump ahead and see that. But I can control the propagation of those particles and some noise and a bunch of other parameters just to control, to go along with the performance. So this piece represents something a little bit more simplistic, even more simple than that last piece, but this is done in Maxim SP Jitter. This is what I used to do for the odd track that we would play guitar, is to have something that was relatively fixed. So here is a video that you can see that's overlaid with some images and 3D geometries created through sound analysis from our output. But you probably noticed that the shading on those 3D models is a little bit basic, as in there aren't any materials on those objects. But you know, it was kind of like learning days. I don't know who else plays around with 3D and Maxim SP Jitter, but it's used to be kind of when the time that this was created. There's that axe, there you go. So, you know, carefully textured axe. Yeah, I've never really understood the 3D side of Maxim SP because it doesn't seem to work very well compared to something like Touch Designer. That was my little political thing right there. We're going to explain our setup. Here's Doug.
As we were working on Fragile, Pincushion, we've been playing together since 2008, and we've always consciously evolved our process, and in particular our musical interfaces, to try to change up our music. A lot of our former pieces were more formally driven, and they've always been more geared toward live performance. And so what we did on this album is we allowed ourselves to explore more intuitive through composed improvisation, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And then we also each completely changed up our interface and abandoned some technologies that we'd been using and some softwares that may have been like guiding our process in one particular direction.
So this is my setup. I've got a Behringer DeepMind 12 inside that flight case that you can't really see. And inside there's also a Raspberry Pi running pure data, and the only thing that's doing is receiving the MIDI signal from the guitar. It's a wireless, one of those triple play audio to MIDI converters for the guitar. And the Raspberry Pi there's a couple pedals coming into it, one for mute, and another one for like a MIDI mute, and the other one for MIDI sustain, which if you're a guitarist and you never had sustain before, it's kind of cool. I mean, don't have to keep playing. So the whole thing of doing eye tracking came about because of a collaboration I was going to do with a pianist that's a electroacoustic work where they can navigate the score and that affects the sound in real time and all that good stuff. But that's going to be that's a grant application that's in the works, so I can't say too much about that. But so yeah, I'm just looking at a sort of available hardware and software solutions to do eye tracking. A lot of the solutions in terms of VR goggles are not usable because the musician has to be able to see as well. So, maybe the HoloLens would be a solution, but I don't have that kind of money. But so you can see that from what I was looking for, pretty much this Tobii Eye Tracker 5 worked out really well. And let's get into some of the details of that. One quick thing before I move on is I see the AR kit, which is for iOS. That might be an interesting solution. If I look at the code or the development kit for that, we have actual eye tracking built into that, where we have a right eye transform as one of the functions and a left eye transform. I'm not sure why you need a separate one for left and right eyes, but that might become obvious when I go cross-eyed. Here's the Tobii hardware. You can see it's like this little, it glows red when it's running, and it clips onto this little magnetic strip that you put onto your tape onto your computer. It goes together pretty good. Here I am looking at the calibration software that comes with the Tobii. You can see it tells you where your head's at. Interestingly, you've got rotation, position of the head, and also the eye tracking. So one of the things I'm interested in is being able to fly, for example, where you can use your head to change direction or to change tilt and I mean to change roll and pitch and yaw, and maybe use your eyes to actually steer your travels. Here's a game that comes with, you can see it's a beat, one of those famous beat games, and you have to use your eyes to trigger the shooting these targets, and it's kind of bizarre to use just your eyes. I can't really explain it without you trying it, but you're not so used to using your head to move towards targets when you're looking, but in this case you really have to just keep your head in one place and use your eyes. Very strange. And here's another game that they're giving away for free as part of the deal. The interesting thing about this in terms of gameplay is that you're using your mouse to control the flashlight direction, whereas you're using the eye tracking to move your camera and look at. And here's a video that I started working on, which I'm trying to get the eye tracking to work with. And it's a video that's using the audio spectrum to light up these little, what are called voxels. And so it's a voxel shader that my son developed some years ago. He said he didn't want credit for it, but it's too late now. Sorry, Louis, you've got credit for the shader. Anyway, looking to expand on this idea, and this is the kind of thing that I want to use for our live videos with the eye tracking.
Hi, I'm Liz K. Miller and I'm an artist and researcher working in printmaking and sound. I'm doing a practice-based PhD at the Royal College of Art in which I'm investigating how listening to the sounds made by trees can reconnect humans to the forest, and how the combination of audio and visual can be used to enhance that connection. Noticed sounds made by trees like transpiration, decomposition and water saturation. I analyse my field recordings through sound visualisation in an attempt to reveal the hidden and unnoticed sonic depths of the sylvan forest. The resulting audiovisual artworks are used to provide audiences with alternative ways of engagement with trees and alternative perspectives of trees. The hope is that this then creates a space for further discussion about the importance of forests in this fragile time of climate and ecological breakdown. In this presentation, I'll be talking about visualising one of my forest soundscapes using photographic cyanotypes, and how listening to the forest sounds led me to think about the notion of multimodal listening. The field recording for this project offers an alternative audio perspective of a rainstorm. This soundscape is an audio record of the first rain in months hitting the dry forest earth during the 2018 summer heatwave in the Forest of Mar in the Scottish Cairngorms. The recording reveals the perspective of a rainstorm that humans don't normally experience. The hidden depths of this soundscape are accessed by recording the rainstorm from beneath the forest floor. I buried 2 hydrophones, these are microphones that can be submerged in water, just underneath the surface of the earth, with the rain hitting them from above. This shift alters the sensorial perspective from the above ground anthropocentric position to the below ground non-human position that potentially a worm or a tree root might experience. I don't attempt to know how a worm or root senses the sound of rain, but the field recording enables imagination of that experience from a non-human perspective. I analysed this field recording using a digital rendering of the sound recording called a spectrogram. In this format, time runs along the horizontal x-axis and frequency or pitch up the vertical y-axis of the image. I combine the spectrogram of the rainstorm soundscape with textures that visually echo the patterns of rain on a window pane, and printed the imagery using the photographic cyanotype process. This technique was traditionally used to reproduce diagrams and architectural blueprints and to document botanical specimens. And these uses all link to my diagrammatical drawing methods and investigation of forest flora. Spectrograms are very good at breaking down frequency or pitch, but I wanted to explore amplitude or volume as well as pitch. And spectrograms do this with colour, but I felt this wasn't the best way to show the full variation in amplitude of the soundscape. So I created 4 cyanotype prints, each corresponding to 4 different decibel ranges. The darkest shows the loudest raindrop sounds, then lighter and lighter shades of blue and pitch, where a work installation called Forest Listening. This was exhibited in an indoor gallery exhibition, an outdoor urban space, and multiple forest locations. In each site, the audio experience would change, so I wanted the visual element of the installation to be site responsive as well. The cyanotypes were remade as outdoor hanging canvas banners. Each banner was made from a slice of the original cyanotypes, enlarged to the height of a person. These sliced up fragments enabled a constantly changing and evolving installation, reflecting how sound is never static, but always changing and taking up space. In March this year, right before the first lockdown, Forest Listening was exhibited in a group exhibition called Ecological Sense at the Hockney Gallery in Kensington in London. The exhibition sought to critique and reflect on current attitudes to materials, modes of production, and the fundamental relationship that humans have with the natural environment. The Hockney Gallery is spacious with a high ceiling which allowed the banners to be raised above the head height of the gallery visitors, inviting them to look up to see the artwork. This echoed the position of the audio recording, which was gathered from below the ground. The field recording of the rainstorm could be listened to with headphones, which created an intimate and personal listening environment. This consideration of the multi-sensory experience of sound, sight, and the physical environment aligns with Steph Serrazzo's concept of multimodal listening. Serrazzo considers listening to be a full-bodied act in which multiple senses shape the listening experience. She's interested in the holistic experience of listening that doesn't isolate senses, and how through the practice of multimodal listening, the body can be retrained to be more aware, alert, and attuned to sonic events in all of their complexity. For Serrazzo, multimodal listening amplifies the ecological relationship between sound, bodies, and environments. For me, the considerations of a multimodal listening practice influence all of the decisions made in each audiovisual installation. And the sound element of the installation played from speakers which lined the open air space. This core wasn't normally used as an exhibition and eating and advertising symposium lecture theatres. The fact that the space acted as a thoroughfare created a disconnect between the sound and the visuals, with the effect that the visuals no longer supported the listening experience and the two elements became separated. Having to compete with multiple other noise sources meant that the audio element of the installation was lost. However, the visuals did create a lot of curiosity, with people paying far more attention to the single tree in the courtyard as a result of the banners and the information provided about the project. This last year, I've been a featured artist in the Surrey Hills Art programme, and one of the projects I developed with them was this created a space amongst the visual we created from it. An experience in which the audience was in amongst both the soundscape and the visuals, with the frequency of the raindrops springing up all around the visitor, both orally and visually. This recreated on a human scale the physical space in which the hydrophones had been buried when making the recording, in the dry earth with the rain pounding down all around them, and through the Scots pine landscape, easily overlooked and past the original soundscape. Unlike the visitors who came to Ecological Sense, the exhibition, who were already interested in themes of ecology, the visitors to Blackheath Forest hadn't anticipated finding an artwork on their daily run or walk. The installation of forest listening back in the forest was an attempt to engage new audiences who might not ordinarily visit art exhibitions. The installation Forest and Investigate Further, the action was to create an unimposing artwork that encouraged curiosity and engagement with the forest and sparked dialogue about the landscape, the soundscape, all worked experience, rain, leading to previously unnoticed or filtered out. Curiosity, when used to artistic ends, has the potential to uncover value in the most unexpected places.
My name is Yati Durant, and I'm going to present the paper entitled Sondaleahari, A Search for a Reciprocal Audiovisual System. I'm going to talk about this project developing audiovisual sound art methods to explore how an audiovisual composition can be interreactively co-composed. And I'm also looking at meanings into the relationship between what we see and what we hear. Some of you that were at Seeing Sound in 2018 may remember the performance of Pixie Dust 2 together with Jules Rawlinson using electronic instruments, together with a linear audiovisual software called PixieVisor, developed by Alexander Zolotov. PixieVisor allows audio signals to be translated directly from video signals and vice versa. And we attempted to create a sort of reciprocal audiovisual performance using the same sounds we were seeing as visuals created in what might be called an in-the-middle kind of improvisational decision-making process. We attempted to play with a sort of pure synesthetic relationship between sound and image. Reciprocal audio and visual relationships, starting with the PixieVisor system, interest me to try and understand and control in some ways what Kandinsky and Schoenberg described as synesthetic dissonance. This is analogous to research in the fields of media music that aim to try and define how the soundtrack can control visual narrative. I'm looking to close the loop, so to speak, in order to reduce any hierarchical relationships to the creative process. I've noticed and researched Norman McLaren's direct audiovisual techniques and many others. The notes of Chuck Jones and other experimental animators also indicate that semiotic meaning exists in how we represent music in symbols, leading to questions about the role of music notation. These all lead to a sort of co-compositional role, even for non-synesthetes, that can exist in audiovisual music. So Pixie Dust and other previous experiments led to the development of an Edinburgh performance of Sondelehari 1 in 2017 for 2 pianos, electronics, and PixieVisor software in its first version, and it was later orchestrated for other performances. With Sondelehari 1, I was looking to experiment with having musicians look at the image created using sounds from their performance, and if seeing changes in the visuals would encourage them to change what variables they might play in their music, but with some new compositional elements. Aside from the direct audio-visual relationship in Sondelehari 1's electronic system, I was also now putting this in the score with some conscious use of structure and space in a new sort of minimalistic way to me, which also helps musicians to understand the system in real time a bit better. My interests in notation have been strongly focused on the structural and semiotic rather than the intrinsically colorful parts of visual music, at least I tend to think so. So here is a fragment of the performance of Sondelehari 1. In 2018, I also premiered Sondelehari 2 at the Forfest Festival for Contemporary Art in Kroměříž, Czech Republic, for two cellos and electronics, but I kind of took a break with the visuals in that piece. In 1996, I was introduced to the structural diagram called the Sri Chakra, used as a meditational focus point or mantra to the practice of understanding meaning in an 8th century text called Sondelehari. This was introduced to my family through our spiritual guru, Nitya Chaitanya Yati. So yes, I am a West Coast 1970s hippie child, and such experiences are not uncommon where I grew up, so please bear with me. I think these influences do shape some of the ways in which I deal with science and creativity. The Sondelehari is a series of poems that outlines concepts of Vedanta, which are based on the understanding of non-duality in Eastern philosophical terms. Since it uses the Sri Chakra, it is interesting because it is geometry, especially how it's made up of triangles, which help to organize the verses. Obviously, triangles are good for music because they are formed from the number 3, which has many musical serial possibilities, and also include the number 4, which multiply together to create the number 12 that is used in the chromatic scale. But they can also, through a bit of processing, create the number 10, which was interesting for Pythagoreans and called the tetactris. I found the number 10 more or less by accident when working on Sondelehari 1 and 2. Perhaps most intriguing for me is that the Sondelehari is written using a sort of proto-language, which, according to the Vedantic scholar Nataraja Guru, is a, quote, earliest and persisting substratum of communication that relies on image and visual reverberation rather than on intellectual discourse. This kind of language usage can be akin to the kind of, quote, seabed, which is home to poetry, music, and the variety of symbolic art forms. So at first I thought it would be useful to use the Sri Chakra to make a sort of social network for collaborations. And I created the Sondelehari project website, which allows audio and video threads to make nonverbal conversations to take place online and to promote creative collaboration. This worked well, but was a bit limited by some problems that I had developing the site using WordPress. My intention is to rebuild this site so that it works properly in the future. I took the Sri Chakra and the website with me to India in 2019 as a guest lecturer at the Srishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology in Bangalore to work with the sound art students of Yashas Shetty. We spent the whole time investigating the symmetry of the Sri Chakra, and afterwards I came up with a symmetrical model that helped to kickstart the composition of Sondelehari 3. With these developments now providing more solutions to the mathematical and creative problems, I've been faced with some technical challenges to improve the flexibility and response in a new audiovisual system setup. As Pixievisor alone is a bit of a beast to handle, and it doesn't really provide the right kind of response for co-composition I've been hoping to create. Books and research on audiovisuality, synesthesia, and other resources such as Derek Holzer's dissertation explore some of the same similar kind of experiments. I agree with Derek that I'd like to avoid the, quote, idea of controlling the audiovisual output symbolically through a, quote, third external source. But I'd also like to avoid over-representing direct relationships or Mickey Mousing. And I've been unsatisfied with the acceptance of arbitrary relationships between audio and video signals. What was needed for the next Sondelehari was a technological system that includes creative processes, proto-language like notation and improvisation, and synths, video synths and computers that allow for a lot of control by the players and are easy to understand in a universal visual semiotic sense. So in this past year, I've been working on Sondelehari 3, which like the other works can have other instrumentations and doesn't really even need to have a fixed format or performance lane necessarily. The main version of this work is a large orchestra version for 40+ musicians, electronics, and plenty of complicated audiovisual things. But thanks to COVID-19, the Brazilian orchestra I was hoping to premiere Sondale Hari 3 with this year is on hiatus. Development on this work has been funded by a Creative Scotland grant, which has helped me to enable purchase of some new equipment, including a proper analog capture box and a new video synthesizer, the Geiske's 3 Trins RGB Plus, and some soldering fun to make some of his hardware plug-in sets. I did manage to have a premiere of a cello, electronics, and visuals version of this work at the International Media, Music, and Sound Arts Network in Education IMSANE Congress in October of this year at the Zurich University of the Arts. Miraculously, we managed to have an in-person audience performance at that symposium. Do you all remember those kind of things? And as this work is designed to be performed with the score live, it's different each time, and we managed to have a very interesting experience. The setup had to be reconfigured to work without all of my modular gear this time, and there were some compromises so that I wouldn't have to carry too much carry-on on the flight there. I used Motu Digital Performer to create a routing matrix for all of the internal and external routing via a Motu AVB interface, which sends and receives both CV and audio signals. And I let the laptop process all of the video recording. I created some envelope following high-frequency oscillators in Reactor to react to various decibel, pitch, and attack parameters of the cello player. Pixie Visor was not working in the performance, but I tuned it to match the frame rate of the video in practice. The background atmosphere is a mix of the 3 Trins audio outputs with a modified version of the famous Metaphysical Fabrications instrument. For my tastes, I like to sample the inputs and resequence them. And so this time I used the real-time USB tape track input of the Teenage Engineering Opizet to create this. The cellist, Nicola Baroni, is a good friend of mine and an excellent musician who understands my notational language well, and I trust a lot. He played fantastically and with almost no explanations needed. So here is a fragment of the live performance. Overall, the performance was met with positivity and seems to verify that this notational language and current setup works quite well with the Srichakra. I've consciously avoided developing a system that was too intelligent or used AI to predict things. And I guess using a modified envelope follower is a bit old school, but tuned correctly, it does the trick. Nicola did mention that we should spend a bit more time dialing in what he would prefer for those to work exactly to his liking. What seems clear for me is that it's better to be less complex than overly complex, and that longer works allow for the audience and the performers time to get used to these new forms of performance. I believe it's actually very useful to apply blank space in a musical score, and that seems to work very well for the musicians as well. Instead of counting empty measures, they create real pauses. As for the actual structure of the Suchakra in the Sandalaya, that is of course highly complex and subjective, and beyond the scope of a short paper, but the works represent this. If you'd like to learn more about the Sandalaya project, a work, and research blog is viewable on my website with a link in the Seeing Sound catalog. Thank you very much for listening.
I will be talking about my practice as a research-based visual artist and filmmaker. In particular, I will be talking about the use of plant chemistry as an image-making tool. You might wonder what this presentation contributes to a conference inquiring the relation between sound and image. The relevance can be understood when looking at synesthesia in contemporary art, an approach that aims to connect two or more distinct disciplines into what we call multimedia art. Multimedia art offers us an experience that appeals to multiple senses, seeing, hearing, feeling, and an experience of temporality and space. All of these can be synesthetic. According to the neurologist Richard Saitowick, synesthesia is amplified in a small number of individuals, but more surprisingly he comes to the conclusion that synesthesia is a standard feature in neural systems. In his own words, "We can speak of synesthesia as a multi-dimensional spectrum in which the upper end prototypes are perceptual synesthesias, such as colored hearing, phoneme tastes, and number forms. At the low end of the spectrum are conventional metaphor and perceptual similarities such as warm and cool colors. Occupying intermediate levels are experiences like goosebumps, empathic pain, imagery inspired by music or an aroma, hypnagogic hallucinations, and Proustian memories evoked by a sensory episode. This suggests that our brain is more flexible and interconnected than we usually assume, and it might be possible to redirect our attention and hone in on certain mental skills that can be developed with proper training. Here, I would like to draw a parallel between my own practice and synesthesia, expanding the concept beyond its regular meaning. To unpack this idea, I have to dig deeper into my practice. My project is driven by the need to rethink our relationship with the natural world. A relationship that is at present defined by exploitation and abuse. This abusive relation is driven to a breaking point, as exemplified by the climate emergency, the sixth mass wildlife extinction, and the all-invasive spread of microplastics. For many years I have been working with analog film and photochemical emulsion, researching possibilities to use the material and the processes required in new and innovative ways. I am interested in both rethinking the image itself and re-engineering the image-making process. Photochemical film does not have a good environmental track record, as it is dependent on silver mining, animal bones for gelatin production, and toxic chemistry for the developing process. Moreover, the photographic and cinematographic apparatus is dependent on similar production processes while replicating an anthropocentric view through its system of mechanics and optics. This anthropocentric view is prevalent in a much more profound way. Culture is normally understood as a purely human domain that springs from our exceptional mental ability to represent our inner and outer world in language, science, pictures and music. Following this line of thought, meaning does emerge purely from the human mind. Animals and plants are excluded from this process. Any inclusion of other than human animals in the cultural domain is met with derision and ridicule. Including plants as carriers of meaning and culture is seen as even more extreme and absurd. To go back to the brain and the mysterious entity that we call mind, a contradiction appears. The mind is usually understood as something immaterial. If the mind indeed has an immaterial presence, the methods and tools of science will not be sufficient to describe its workings. Either religion or mystification can fill this gap. But if we accept this step as a necessity, we abandon the very foundations of modern thought. If, contrarily, the mind has a material presence, its exceptional appearance in humans only must be questioned. A material mind is by definition a mind that is based on a set of deductible processes that has evolved to further complexity. Therefore, there is no reason to believe that similar processes are unavailable beyond the human. In his recent book, Galileo's Error, the contemporary philosopher Philip Goff, who advocates a line of thought known as panpsychism, puts it like this. We have good reasons to think that the conscious experience of a horse is much less complex than that of a human being, and the experience of a chicken less complex than those of a horse. As organisms become simpler, perhaps at some point the light of consciousness suddenly switches off, with simpler organisms having no experience at all. But it is also possible that the light of consciousness never switches off entirely, but rather fades as organic complexity reduces, through flies, insects, plants, bacteria and amoebae. When following this proposition, I want to recall the notion of synesthesia as an entanglement of normally distinct senses, hearing colors, seeing a melody. If we accept that the quality of mind can be present beyond the human, such a synesthetic experience might also be useful to understand an awareness beyond the human. When communicating with animals or plants, we cannot rely on verbal communication. An alternative could be to be much more attentive to signals that can be perceived by a multitude of species, such as color, smell, temperature, vibration, intensity of light, humidity, and so forth. In other words, tapping into the realm called biosemiotics. Biosemiotics is a field developed by Tomas Sebiok, a Hungarian-born American semiotician. This is where my practice is situated. I am particularly interested in plants. Plants are generous in the sense that they are easy to harvest and contain a multitude of components. After picking some parts, a plant will grow back and might even be stimulated to develop a tougher appearance. When thinking about their appearance, we could say that the plants explore their surroundings in a methodical way, rhythmically expanding through time and space. Contrarily to the sudden movements of animals, the movement of a plant is gradual. Besides this gradual movement, plants also tend to vibrate in close unison with their environment. Plants are prone to repetition. Certain structures and forms appear in different sizes throughout their body. This results in an aesthetically pleasing appearance as seen from a human perspective. As already mentioned, plants respond to light, temperature, humidity, magnetic fields and many other triggers. More surprisingly, plants communicate by means of chemical signals, both airborne and underground. Knowledge about this chemical form of communication has expanded recently by means of innovative scientific methods that look at communities of plants rather than distinct individuals or species. When I now go back to my practice as a photographer and filmmaker, a recent revelation was to discover that early photographic developers were based on a chemical compound harvested from the bark of trees. Bark contains a chemical compound belonging to the phenol family. In early photographic developer, phenol is the main reactive constituent. Using plant-based phenol in photographic developer was repopularized through the experiments undertaken during the photographic class of Dr. Scott Williams at the Rochester Institute for Technology. The resulting formula is known as caffeinol, a developer that relies on tannic acid, a polyphenol that is abundant in coffee beans. The fact that phenols in plants can be used as a photographic developer led me to start a series of experiments using plants as active image makers. In short, my technique involves a careful selection of leaves or flowers, looking at the size, the form, the prevalence of the species, the known uses of the plant, and its possible congruence with a certain film frame or paper size. The selection is soaked in a solution that contains a certain amount of vitamin C and soda crystals. This admixture brings out the polyphenols and boosts the reactivity of the vegetal material. The treated material is brought in contact with photochemical emulsion, while simultaneously making a composition that joins the plant's natural appearance with the aesthetic possibilities that a film strip or a sheet of photographic paper have to offer. The chemistry contained in a plant will render an image with a remarkable detail. Not only its outer appearance, but also its inner structure becomes visible. Variables such as temperature, humidity, available light and the specifics of the photographic material used will impact on the color, contrast and density of the image. I have coined this technique phytography, and the images are phytograms. This technique can be placed in a broader context of alternative photography, resembling both classic avant-garde techniques such as the photogram and chemigram, and contemporary bioart that uses bacteria or algae in a process known as biophotographicity. However, my interest in this is certainly not only technical, but very much directed at the development of a qualitative understanding of plants. Through a prolonged and intense observation of and collaboration with different plant species and distinct individuals, a real and lived relationship can be developed. Making works of art, either series of still images or moving images, is in this case perceived by me as a form of co-creation. When making multimedia art, co-creation is a well-known practice, bringing visual and sonic experts together. My proposition is that photography allows me to co-create with plants. The plants have something to show for. By assuming that the plant also has an awareness, a whole new universe opens up. The plants are my teachers, and I am the intermediate who passes on some of their knowledge. In order to make this more tangible, I'm including a short excerpt of my film photography. Thank you for watching.
Hi, my name's Rob Mackay, and I'm a senior lecturer in composition at Newcastle University. And I'm going to be talking to you about the project Following the Flight of the Monarchs, which is an interdisciplinary acoustic ecology project linking together ecosystems and communities across the migration routes of the monarch butterfly as it performs this incredible 3,000-mile migration between Canada and Mexico every year. There's 4 generations a year, and we're just at the point in the cycle at the moment where the monarchs have arrived in Mexico for overwintering. They arrive around November and they will stay there until February, and then they will start the journey north again to Texas. They'll lay their eggs there, and then the whole cycle will start all over again. So my journey with monarch butterflies started in 2015 when I visited the El Rosario Reserve in Mexico, and I was able to film the monarchs and also record them flying in swarms of millions. You don't usually think of butterflies making much sound, but when they swarm in millions, you can actually hear this beautiful rushing sound of their tiny wings. And as a sound artist myself, I thought this was too much of a challenge to not try and take to capture this rather wonderful and delicate sound. I actually then integrated this material into an installation that I created for the Amy Johnson Festival in Hull. So that was its first outing. And I worked with a number of other colleagues to create this wooden structure representing a kind of hide-like structure that you might find in a forest. And we're recreating a sense of looking out at the forest through windows that are the screens in this case. So there's 4 video screens and 4 loudspeakers. And there are actually 3 layers to the sound component as well. The first layer is some field recordings of the environment itself, including the rushing of the monarch's tiny wings. There's also a specially commissioned poem by the Mexican poet Rolando Rodriguez in Spanish, based around the scientific knowledge that we have around how the monarchs migrate, but told from a very emotive perspective. And then there's also a musical layer, which is actually an improvisation that I performed with a number of other musicians on the day that I recorded the monarch butterflies. I've also manipulated that layer as a kind of glue to stick the field recordings and the poetry together in this immersive installation, which is kind of like teleporting you to southern Mexico as you walk inside that immersive space. We, since the Amy Johnson Festival, have toured it around various venues, including the Eden Project down in Cornwall. That's the top of the screen that you can see there. And then that same summer, in 2017, we took it to the Shambhala Festival, which you can see outside. I think that's my favorite rendition of it, where you're walking outside in the English countryside, and then you walk inside that hide and you're kind of teleported to southern Mexico. We also took it to Whitby Music Port that year as well. As I say, this is sort of a list of all the different people that collaborated with on creating that. We've also done a kind of screen version of this, sort of multi-screen version for concert and sort of cinema type showings. So New York Electroacoustic Music Festival, ICMC. We also presented it at Seeing Sound, I think it was a couple of years ago. Through the process of creating that installation, I did much more research around monarch butterflies, and I became very aware of the plight that they're facing with various threats to their habitat. And actually, their numbers have decreased by nearly 90% over just 2 decades. And we think there are 3 main factors affecting this. One is industrial use of herbicides and pesticides, particularly in the Corn Belt in the US, which is killing off all of the milkweed, which is the only plant that the monarchs can lay their eggs on, the only plant that their larvae eat. There's also big issues around deforestation, particularly in Mexico. When the monarchs migrate there, they only occupy the mountaintops. They only roost above 10,000 feet. So the whole sort of migratory population is squashed into these very small areas, which are then very vulnerable. And also climate change is affecting them. Freak storms can wipe out large numbers of them. And when I was talking to Lincoln Brower a few years ago, world-leading monarch specialist, he described one time where he was walking through 2 feet deep of monarch butterfly bodies that had been wiped out by a storm. So with this in mind, and with the kind of research focus that I've had over the last 7 to 10 years or so, becoming increasingly interested in the field of soundscape ecology and ecoacoustics as this sort of interdisciplinary art science field, where sound can be used as a form of acoustic monitoring and as a gauge of the health of an ecosystem. I have been working with a number of partners, first starting in Mexico, but now I've also branched out to Canada and the US as well, to install stream boxes, which actually live stream via the internet high quality audio streams. So rather than making recordings, these are kind of continuous data streams that can be accessed by anyone anywhere in the world. So we can share this with scientists all over the world potentially. We're also linking with Leah Barclay's UNESCO Biosphere Soundscapes project, and our main sort of technical collaborators are SoundCamp, who are a UK-based organisation who have been making the stream boxes and facilitating really the technology. I went back to Mexico in 2018 with the intention to install our first stream box in the Cerro Pelon UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, which is a monarch butterfly sanctuary, working with butterfly specialist Pablo Jaramillo Lopez. We've also been working closely with Butterflies and Their People Arborists scheme, which provides paid roles to people in that region to become stewards of the forest. So we're listening to the live streams. We're able to listen to the range of different bird species and other insects that are communicating in that habitat. If the monarch's health is being affected so much across those migratory routes, what other species are being affected? These sort of broader changes in the environment. How is the whole ecosystem being affected? So by listening into the biodiversity and also the sort of ecosystem dynamics through sound, that could potentially build up a picture of this change over time. In addition to the sort of species that are communicating via sound, I talked about that sort of swarming behavior of the monarch butterflies, and that you can actually hear the sound of their tiny wings. And when I talked to Lincoln Brower, who has sadly passed away now, I asked him about whether it might be useful to use sound to monitor the monarch's behavior. If we had sensitive enough microphones, we could hear when they're swarming. Usually when they're overwintering, they cluster around trees underneath the forest canopy to stay warm, and they can only fly once they've heated up enough in direct sunlight. But they need to be able to fly because they have to fly down to a nearby meadow to drink water and to drink nectar. Otherwise they would die as well. So can we see this sort of link between the amount of sunshine and how much sort of swarming behavior the monarchs sort of perform? So this is me recording them in 2018 in the Cerro Pelon Reserve. It's quite a beautiful sight, all those butterflies. And as an example, this is the meadow, and I'm going to play you the sounds of that meadow when the monarch butterflies aren't there. And now when they are there swarming. that was actually one flying into the microphone. So with these stream boxes installed, or that first one certainly in setup alone, those are then live streamed via the Locus Sonus sound map, which is run by the University of Marseille. This is an open source sound map. Anyone can access this and become a user. So all of these pins that you can see on the screen now represent a live audio stream by different people running those all over the world. And different ones are popping up all the time. You can actually convert your mobile phone into a streaming device. We've actually been using Raspberry Pi computers for our stream boxes. This is our elated faces when we finally managed to get everything working in Mexico. That was it on the map. This is what it looks like on the side of the mountain with a solar powered setup linked to a cell network. And we shared a short recording of from that stream with ornithologists at the Autonomous University of Mexico, and they were able to identify 10 bird species from that. And I'll just play you a short clip. Another aspect to the project has actually been interacting with the environment and the other sort of non-human agents within those through performances and interacting musically with the environment. So this is David Blink, American performer who I've been working with, playing handpan amongst the butterflies. They're low on the ground there because they're drinking the dew, the morning dew. Just going to stop that for a second because I want to share with you. I've also been taking my flute, and the next phase of this has actually been creating these 360 videos. I've been creating ambisonic surround sound recordings, as well as these 360 videos, so you can use these with VR headsets. So we want to create a series of installations that use the VR aspect as well, so maybe that's something for Seeing Sound next year. And the plan is eventually to have at least 5 stream boxes installed as this network across the migratory routes, including the west coast as well, because there's a smaller population that migrates there. So at the moment we've got a box in Mexico and also one in Canada. And as well as sharing these with scientists and citizen scientists for environmental monitoring, we're using these for performances and installations. And our recent performances have been online via the Locus Sonus sound map. So this is with Rolando, David. So Rolando's in Mexico there, David's in California, I was in Leeds, and we also have on the left video from Jessica Rodriguez, who's a video artist based at McMaster University. And probably don't have time to play you a clip of that, but I can share a YouTube video link in due course if people are interested in that. Yes, this is a live telematic performance where we're using the Locus Sonus sound map to stream the instrumentalists, and we're also live streaming in the soundscapes, and we're interacting with those as well as recording. So there's these different temporalities that we're working against as well. And finally, I've just finished making a 30-minute radio program for BBC Radio 3 for Between the Ears. It's called The Flight of the Monarch, and it is going to be broadcast on Sunday the 3rd of January 2021 at 6:45 on BBC Radio 3. So hopefully a lovely way to start the new year. You'll hear much more about the project there, as well as some improvisations in the reserves and field recordings. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you get to listen to the radio program, and look forward to talking to you perhaps in the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Hi, my name's Dan Tapper, and I'm going to talk about my recent work with photogrammetry, which is the process of taking lots of images of an object or space and using software to stitch those together into 3D models. In my work, I've been investigating the underlying point clouds and wireframes of these 3D models and utilizing them to create generative art and sound studies using sonification techniques. This paper is a way of detailing my recent experiments to expand these techniques beyond the three-dimensional models into interlinked audiovisual networks. The experiments were initially driven by a desire to use pen plotters to draw three-dimensional images in a two-dimensional form, but I also found that my investigations in this area had overlap with virtual worlds that I've been developing, specifically interacting with sound in VR spaces. Before I get started, before the main body of the presentation, a little bit of information about me. I'm originally from the UK. I actually studied my undergraduate degree at Bath Spa in music technology. And after that, I moved to the States and eventually ended up settling in Toronto, where I've been living on and off since 2016. I started my career primarily as a sound artist, but through my interest in programming, got really into practitioner. I also spend quite a lot of my time building software and interactive solutions for other artists, often composers. This work often is in the form of audio processing software or interactive environments where people's gestures are controlling sound and visual in some way. So on to part one, quarantine and photogrammetry. So at the beginning of quarantine, I had started working on a project called New Digital Worlds, which was a funded project by Arts Council England as part of the Developing Your Creative Practice grant, where I basically got a grant to start developing and learning how to create work in virtual reality spaces. This began really simply with just a 360 camera and an Xbox Kinect, and I began exploring my internal spaces during the lockdown. For me, this was quite a creative period of just very basic experimentation and also rethinking my living space, as I had at this period lost access to my studio during the lockdown. So I had to kind of rework how to work in my own space. This is when I began using photogrammetry techniques. Particularly this was inspired by the fact that I was not finding the scans I was getting through the Kinect to be best to my liking. So I looked for other methods of creating 3D models that had potential to be a bit more malleable and advanced in terms of taking them outside and moving around and also getting a more cohesive, realistic image. The first app that I tried for this was called Patchy Scan 3D, and it really is very lo-fi and quite glitchy, but I actually really liked this aesthetic, even though it still wasn't the more polished, realistic 3D object look I was going for. But I started just in my experiments building this into the work I was doing. I built some software in processing and Max just to kind of start breaking apart these images, and created a very short series of sketches called Inbound Unbound. Inbound Unbound explored composed audiovisual relationships, but doesn't include more direct sonification-based methods of sound control and composition, and this was something I really wanted to correlate more closely in future works. At the same time, my photogrammetry patches to engage with these models, for example, morphing between multiple models. I was very interested in this visual effect of these morphed images and wanted to port this into a physical medium, using a pen plotter to draw the dense clusters of lines. The first challenge in using these three-dimensional images with a two-dimensional drawing device was exporting the data into a format that the plotter could understand, particularly as I was not familiar with methods in Max for exporting vector graphics from GL environments. In the end, to access the three-dimensional data, I built a simple sketch that converted the 3D output into a matrix and then saved the matrix as a text file. I could then use this to recompile the object in 3D software as a vector graphic, and then I was using processing to alter and manipulate the graphic to basically render out into a vector file which I could then draw. It was at this point that I really realized that the 3D data also had potential to be a sonification sonic control system. In terms of developing my point cloud into a sonification or music control system, there were a wide variety of mappings that were available to me. The data I exported contained XYZ position values as well as texture coordinates, giving me a potential 6 mappings. In addition to creating mappings, I had to create methods for selecting single and multiple points and navigating through these points. An early sketch details some proposed mappings and navigational methods. In this section, I'm going to take a look at the patches that I've built for this project. And I've really built 2 main patches. One deals with all my 3D information, so basically loading in the 3D shape, breaking it apart, accessing a number of points, and then sending it to my second patch, which is a granular system where I can control parameters based on every point in the cloud. I can assign those points and their XYZ texture coordinate values as well to the grains. And I've also programmed in things, for example, like the rotation of the shape in the 3D space is going to control things like Doppler effects and also pan. To select points, basically I drag and it kind of does a group select of points. I can also kind of move through the shape, the object. So this is one way of accessing these individual points, or I can sample them at random with this slider here. If you want to load in new shapes, just click here and load in different shapes. We can see where the specific grain that we'll be accessing is with this pink point. And right now I haven't really tweaked the controls very much, so it's just going to be doing volume control really as it goes up and down in those values. And I'm going to start spinning the shape. And we can hear that Doppler shift a little bit there as well. So in terms of playback, we have a number of ways of playing back as well. So right now that is basically, the playback mode is set to user position, which is basically you select a point in your sound file and it just plays back from that point. You can do things like scale the pitch. Right now it's not scaled to change other than basically everything will be the same pitch. If you scale the pitch between the number of values, you'll get different pitches. Also, for example, I can change the grain slope, which is basically the envelope. I can add in a deviation, and I can change the window of the grain, so that creates more variety in the grains. That's more of a random parameter. So user position is not super interesting sonically. It gets much more interesting as a tool when we start using the position of the 3D grain, which basically controls where we are in the sound file. And we have two methods of moving through that section of the sound file, either chronologically, where we basically follow the pointer going through the grains in the data file, or we can go through that set of points selected at basically randomly. So let's first try chronologically. And if I select random, we'll see that the same points in that selection will be hit with our program, but basically we'll be jumping through them in a random order. And this is if we select a series of random points throughout the point cloud. And let's try a different shape. The 3D grain position is more interesting here. And we can see how many points are selected. It's 518. And now random. Do more extreme things with the rotation and the Doppler shift as well. So if we turn that up and then turn this back on. Currently I am mapping the grain position, pitch and amplitude to values from the XYZ position of points. I'm also implementing user-controlled panning and Doppler-esque pitch shifting via rotation of the object by the user. In terms of developing this project further into a more controllable audiovisual tool, I plan to expand mappings to include texture coordinates. I also plan to implement point-controlled FFT filtering for grains on an individual level, methods of creating different rhythmic patterns from areas of point density, and ways of sequencing sonic content so it can be used more predictably for musical performance. Visually, I plan to implement more fleshed out objects, allow for object morphing, and apply textures. In the most current development, I have added a particle movement function where particles drift from their current positions as 3D random walkers, creating new combinations of audiovisual point control.